Yeah.
Hello, hi everyone. You're very welcome to our online discussion, Citizens and Citizenship. My name is Brendan Maher. I'm the Artistic Director here in the Source Arts Centre in Thurles in County Tipperary, Ireland. So we've got a current exhibition in our gallery. It's entitled Citizens by photographer Seamus Murphy. We're going to be speaking to Seamus tonight. Seamus is well known for his war and social photography across the Middle East, UK, America and Ireland, and additionally for his work with singer-songwriter PJ Harvey. We'll also be speaking to historian and broadcaster Diarmaid Ferriter. Diarmaid's Professor of Modern Irish History in University College Dublin, and he's written 11 books, including The Transformation of Ireland, 1900 to 2000, and A Nation and Not a Rabble, The Irish Revolution, 1913 to 23. For those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, just to see behind me, Citizens deals with ideas of citizenship through a series of photographs of Irish War of Independence veterans taken by Seamus more than 20 years ago, and a recently taken series of images of the Syrian community who came to live here in Thurles via Jordan after being displaced by the Syrian civil war almost 5 years ago. Both sets of images deal with individuals and communities coming to terms with a post-conflict world. The exhibition, as you can see here, is wall-mounted with 26 works printed on cloth rather than paper, and the gallery space also features a large collage of images on a central canvas with both communities on each side. So with regards to asking questions during the online chat, you're welcome to ask questions via the chat facility down below, basically. So I'm going to go to Seamus first of all. Seamus, you're very welcome. You're in Vauxhall in London, aren't you?
I am. Yeah.
So that's where you're based at the moment. Can I just ask you with regards to the actual exhibition and the coming to Ireland in 1998, what was in your mind with regards to putting this series of images together?
Well, this was something that I was working with a writer called Patrick Cooney, who had done a lot of research on this subject. It was something that he'd been working on for a while. And he and I had actually been working quite a bit together on various sort of journalistic features. And we got a commission from The Guardian to do this. This was something we wanted to do, and we tried to get it commissioned all the way through Fleet Street. And there was only one person who went with it, and it was Deborah Orr at The Guardian weekend magazine. So we had a commission, which was great, because it's sort of subject that would have been difficult to probably get commissioned any other time. You know, the Good Friday Agreement was happening. Neil Jordan's Michael Collins was being talked about and about to be released. There was a mood, I think, where there was an appetite for this story, which probably a couple of years before would have been very difficult. So I came to Ireland in 1998 with this very specific idea to track down and talk to and photograph the remaining people from the War of Independence. We couldn't find anyone who was still alive from 1916, so the War of Independence was the next. And they ranged from 95 years of age to 105, and the 105-year-old is a local man from Tipperary.
And Seamus, you've got some of the images there. Basically, we're going to have a quick look through them. Basically, with regards to that person that's from Tipperary is John Ryan. Is it Jack Ryan?
John Ryan. Yeah.
From Holyford, basically, and he was 105 at that point, wasn't he?
He was 105, and we knocked on his door, expecting someone else to answer the door and to go inside, because a lot of these guys were very old, and there was one woman as well. They're all very old, and mobility was an issue with some of them. Some of them were very sprightly. Well, John Ryan answered the door. I was amazed when I got to the door, knocked the door. This man answered, and he was carrying a melodeon, a music box, and we'd heard music in the kitchen when we were knocking on the door, and this guy comes to the door, and I said, "Is John Ryan here? I think he's expecting us." And he said, "That's me." Couldn't believe it. Extraordinary. 105 years of age.
And had you arranged that? Did you sort of ring ahead with regards like
Yes,
setting up a shelter
yes,
for people?
that had been set up, and yeah, you could. I mean, with people of that age, you couldn't doorstep them as such.
Of course,
No. Yeah, might be
So
fake.
let's have a look through some of the images. Basically,
Sure.
we have you have like a lot of shots basically with regards
Yeah.
to the work that are not.
Is that
Not
showing now?
Yeah, go ahead.
You do that. Yeah.
Bring me up, Lonnie.
So this is Dan Ballykeating. He's Kerry Number 1 Brigade. I've got some quotes from him. He got his first firearm by buying it from a soldier from the Lancashire Regiment. One day, he said, he passed a remark in a shop, and this guy said to him, "If you want a rifle, I can get you one to sell you." They agreed on the price of £1. He said he could have been a plant, but my great friend Machine Gun Johnny O'Connor said he thought I should risk it. So he met up later with the guy at the back of a graveyard, and sure enough, he gave me a grand Lee Enfield for £1. So sorry, there you go. Talking about ambushes, he said there was no fear at all. On one occasion, there were 12 tans that went to collect their monthly pay in Tralee on bicycles, fully armed. We ambushed them, 8 killed, 3 wounded, and 1 escaped. All the equipment, rifles, and ammunition was captured. That's what we needed more than anything else. We asked him about, killing people in ambushes. He said, "It never bothered me. I mean, you went out to do a job. If you think you were hoping to, I think you were actually hoping to kill someone," he said. An IRA man never went into confession box to a priest and said, "I shot a policeman," or if they did, they were wrong to shoot him. This is John Snee, East Mayo Brigade. On Terence McSweeney's death and the Kilmichael ambush, he had to say, "I was now based in Manchester, and it made me think to get back to Ireland and start really fighting. A lot of the IRA were in England waiting for instructions in case there was going to be a campaign there. But McSweeney and Kilmichael brought a lot of us home." He was very interesting because he ended up, like a lot of IRA guys, going to America after the Civil War. There was nothing for them in Ireland. And he said, "I tried to make things happen. I tried to make things work when I came out." He was in prison before this. And my part of the country was very Republican, which was Mayo. But you knew deep down you were the beaten side, and that seeped in. All my friends were going to the States. I thought, we'll reform, organize, and start again wherever. And Snee spent over 50 years living in America. He was significantly involved in Republican pressure groups such as IRA Veterans of America. His oldest son is a decorated Vietnam vet. And this is John holding a Mauser from the Howth Rifles in Kilmainham Jail. This is Sean Clancy, pictured at Collins Barracks in Dublin. He was a County Clare veteran, but later transferred to the Dublin Brigade. Talking of the 1916 executions, he said, "The papers carried the news and you could see the change of heart in the people. Each day the British shot 2 or 3, dragging it out over a few weeks. When they shot MacDermott, who was crippled, and put Connolly into a chair to shoot him because his leg was gangrenous and he couldn't stand, that was it for me. I was utterly appalled and just had to do something." On becoming a volunteer, he said, a company of volunteers were founded in my parish in County Clare, and I used to parade with them. Eventually, I joined up and took the oath, and that was that. The British government wanted to introduce conscription at the time for the Great War, but nobody here wanted to get involved. We'd fight in our own country for our own country.
Can I ask you with regards to the context of last shot? What is the previous shot with the soldiers there? Where is that coming from? What's
that is Collins Barracks. These are national soldiers, Irish national soldiers. Because Sean went on to become a national soldier.
Okay.
Yeah, and he in the Civil War he fought on the Free State side. A lot of the people in my series were Republicans and stayed Republicans.
Sure.
This is Kitty Bennett. She was a member of Come On, Come On. She was raised in a strong Republican family. All of her brothers were in the IRA. Kitty joined the Republican movements. The women's movement, Come On, Come On. She acted as a courier, scout, and intelligence officer for some of the most renowned field commanders of the war, like Dan Breen and Sean Tracy. Her family home was used as an IRA HQ in County Tipperary, and it doubled as a dressing station during ambushes and used as billets for the flying columns throughout the Black and Tan War. Taking the anti-treaty side, which is the Republican side, during the Civil War, she accompanied Eamon de Valera on missions throughout the south of the country, and was entrusted to carry the order of surrender from Dublin to the Republican forces in Cork, effectively ending the Civil War. This is Captain John Ryan, 3rd Cork Brigade, last surviving officer of legendary guerrilla leader Tom Barry. He was involved in ambushes, barrack burnings, and shootouts. He was intent on avenging Major Percival of the Essex Regiment, who was a local leader. Percival was notorious among the people of West Cork for torture and taking pot shots at farm workers or on early morning drives. When confronted with an opportunity to finish Percival off in a field, the firing pin of his gun failed him. I wanted to get that bastard so badly, he said, and it's to my eternal regret that I didn't. He emigrated to Australia and farmed cattle. This, Jack was in a care home, as was Kitty. I mean, a lot of them were either being helped by their family or were in care homes. This is Bat Moriarty, intelligence officer, J Company, Cork number 4 Brigade. On his service, he says, I was an armed guard at Tom O'Cannon's house near Mill Street, watching the black and tans who used to leave the barracks at night to burn and destroy property and leave many families homeless. Describing his role in the Rathcoole ambush, he said, when we were all assembled, Commandant Con Meany asked us to kneel down on the road and recite the rosary. When we'd finished, we proceeded to Kilcorny, where we met another party of volunteers. At that time, some of the volunteers had traveled long distances and were hungry. Food was soon provided in the form of buckets of milk and brown bread. We then proceeded over the hill to Rathcoole, where several more volunteers had gathered, numbering over 100 men with rifles, shotguns, and machine guns. Mines were laid under the road, and the columns waited for the convoy to attack. After the Rathcoole ambush, I had to leave home on several occasions for fear of reprisals and roundup. And here he is with his wife and, his wife and his daughter, again, being looked after at home in Mill Street. Now, this is Francis Stewart, Dublin Brigade. He was a veteran and novelist, and this is in his home in Dundrum in Dublin. During the Civil War, he edited leaflets and ran messages for De Valera's Republicans and was subsequently imprisoned. He lived in Berlin as an academic during World War II, doubling as a courier for the IRA, and became part of the Nazi war effort. He wrote scripts for Lord Haw Haw, otherwise known as William Joyce. He said, I had a light machine gun at the time. It was a very, very efficient weapon, and I've since sometimes wished I still had it. Jack Reardon, 1st Brigade. On the Kilmichael ambush, he came upon the site the morning after. He was a young man at the time. I'd heard a tremendous round of firing the night before, and I could see flames from the burning lorries rising up in the sky. The next day I headed down. The bodies were still on the road, left out all night, and 3 lorries of tans came up. I don't think they knew about the disaster ahead because they could have shot us quite easily. We took off, and I wasn't very far up the road, and I could see the smoke rising from the houses. The tans were burning everything in Kilmichael. On Michael Collins, he said, I hated Michael Collins. I do still. I was damn glad when I heard he was shot. I'm glad still. He died fighting for England. This guy was quite a character. He died fighting for England. He died taking orders from Lloyd George. He's the cause of all our trouble since. Oh. On the ambush at Crossbarry, he says, Crossbarry was a masterpiece. Barry fixed it so well. I would say his men were the cause of the truce. Now, this is John Ryan, the 105-year-old in Tipperary. Tipperary Brigade. He said there were a number of people in Tipperary who had sons in the British Army and they wouldn't want to fight at all. The mothers or wives were getting money sent regularly, and if their man was killed in Flanders, there'd be a pension. They were thinking of one thing, money, but we carried on. So this is him 10 minutes after I walked in the door, and that's his wife in the background playing the melodeon.
Seamus, they look as just the photographs in general with regards to what the way they're shot. The people look quite proud, and they've got quite distinctive personalities in the sense of they're not cowed by the camera in any manner, which some people are, I suppose.
Very much so, and you know they knew I was coming, but they were very they were sort of military like in their bearing, and also they were very proud of their appearance. They were all quite dapper, and really kept themselves well, and I think that's. It probably goes back to the discipline they went through. It was they were very young when this happened. When you think that these guys were alive in 1998 and the war was 1919, 1920, they were very, very young, in their late teens. So whatever, this would have been a very defining thing for them in their lives. I think they would have carried it with them for the rest of their lives. And in fact, you got that impression when you met them. They were so full of life, full of vim, full of spirit, very proud of what they'd done. Which is interesting because I think in 1998, people were happy enough they weren't, shouting from the rooftops. This is Patsy Holmes, 4th Cork Brigade, recalling a house raid. He said, in November 1920 at 4:30 in the morning, my door was broken into and an RIC sergeant ran up the stairs, 2 flights of stairs, got me out of bed, got me down before him, and there was another officer waiting in the kitchen with 5 or 6 soldiers. When he brought me down, I stood in front of him. They brought down another brother of mine, 14 years of age. I appealed to the officer to let my brother go. He was too young. He let him go and he said to me, if you attempt to escape, my brother is a crack shot. I said I couldn't escape because my mother and father, 2 young nephews, my sister and brother would be in danger of the house being burned down, and my life wouldn't be worth that. He said, I set out to see Ireland free, free from the smock to the gown and from the language of the Sassenach. Oh. And this is Dan Goggin. He was an IRA veteran of the War of Independence and subsequent Civil War, seen here at Macroom, at his home in Macroom. And these are the last pictures. This is the War of Independence Medal or Black and Tan Medal, awarded to people proven to have been involved in the war. Many volunteers refused it as a protest against the free state of 26 counties.
Lovely, they're beautiful pieces. Yeah, they're lovely shots, absolutely. Diarmaid, can I come to you? Diarmaid, could you give us a little bit of context for the War of Independence in which all these men and women fought? I think I'm sort of interested in the area just post 1916 and then after Sinn Féin winning the election in 1918. Did the Sinn Féin win in the election give the War of Independence an inevitability or like a political legitimacy in regards like that it was going to happen basically?
2 nice hot potatoes to start with, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be here. And Seamus, thanks a million for that tour of those remarkable images. They really, they're powerful. And what's interesting in relation to your question, Brendan, is thinking about that question alongside the images of those men and that woman. Because really, there are 2 different things going on during the War of Independence. There is obviously a political war of independence and a military war of independence. And a lot of the images that we're looking at, they're not about politics. They're soldiers. They see themselves as soldiers. They still saw themselves as soldiers at a much later stage. And they're not necessarily interested as intensely in the political process. A lot of them, indeed, many of them had quite a skepticism about politics. So that in itself is an interesting tension, you know. Was it inevitable after December 1918? Well, December 1918 is an absolutely crucial turning point because what Sinn Féin has is a mandate for a republic. It stands on the platform of an Irish republic. It trounces the Irish Parliamentary Party, which has been carrying the constitutional nationalist tradition. The Home Rule project is dead. Sinn Féin wins 73 out of the 104 seats available. Of course, it's not going to take up its seats. It's a very emphatic victory. It's also a much expanded electorate. There hadn't been a general election since 1910. In 1910, only 900,000 people could vote. By 1918, 1.9 million people can vote in Ireland as a result of the extension of the vote to women over the age of 30 with property qualifications and the lowering of the voting age for men as well. So it's a much expanded electorate. So Sinn Féin can claim it has a mandate. Britain is not going to recognise that mandate. Unionists, particularly in Ulster, are certainly not going to recognise that mandate. So it's certainly a political conundrum. But in relation to inevitability and in relation to what people were voting for in December 1918 in Ireland, that's a crucial point as well. Were they voting for war? Not necessarily. Sinn Féin's manifesto said that they would use any means available and necessary in order to render impotent the power of Britain to rule Ireland. But there was a degree of ambiguity about that. I mean, did that mean an armed campaign or what precisely was it? And there was a very interesting character, Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was one of the vice presidents of Sinn Féin at the time, probably the best known Republican priest in the country. The way he put it after the election was the people who voted Sinn Féin, now we have to establish what Sinn Féin stands for. There was still a degree of ambiguity about what might happen next. I mean, they had promised to set up their own parliament, which they duly did in January. But what happened on the same day, of course, the opening shots in Tipperary and Salahead Beg at the beginning of the War of Independence, that wasn't authorised by Sinn Féin. That was a solo operation by volunteers in Tipperary who were very impatient that not enough was happening. So, you know, it's not actually until 1921 that the Dáil actually takes responsibility for the actions of the IRA. So, you know, the issue of whether it was inevitable or not, it's caught up in an awful lot of those different themes. I mean, one thing was absolutely clear, of course, is that Britain was not going to recognise the legitimacy of Sinn Féin's electoral platform, or indeed the legitimacy of the Dáil that it established. But it wasn't a normal parliament in the sense that only 27 Sinn Féin TDs were available to meet in the Mansion House in January 1919. So many of them were in jail and on the run because of the things that had happened post 1916. So, you know, I think we've got to, particularly when we're looking at those images, we've got to think, yes, of a political process and a political campaign for independence, which is also about bringing the message abroad. De Valera heading off to the United States for 18 months, trying to whip up international support for a republic. But for those people we were looking at, it was about what was happening on the ground. And they constructed their own narratives in the aftermath too. I mean, it's not true that there was no fear, for example, when it came to ambushes and when it came to military activities. Certain narratives are constructed afterwards that with distance and the passage of time can be cemented into emphatic assertions that weren't necessarily felt at the time. As Seamus points out, these were very young men and women, late teens, early 20s. Revolutions are driven by younger people, by younger fighters. And certainly there was a lot of courage and nobility and bravery on display throughout the revolutionary period. But of course, there was the flip side to that we associate with every war, which is that terrible things are done by both sides. So that was something else that generation were carrying. And that's why I find it so powerful to look at the images of them at such an advanced age. What had they lived through? You know, you mentioned emigration there. That's one part of the post-revolutionary story. That photograph that was held up of Ballykinlar prison camp, many of them endured appalling conditions in internment camps. Many men and women went on hunger strike, both during the War of Independence and Civil War. Some of them carried the after effects, both physical and mental, for decades afterwards. Many of them were carrying various degrees of trauma, and you won't necessarily find them articulating that publicly. But we can now, because we have access to so many more intimate sources, particularly people who applied for pensions, the military service pensions in the aftermath. You know, we've a much greater sense of the intricacies of difficult and often broken lives afterwards. And that's not in any sense to suggest that what they did or what they were involved in was not a worthy cause as they saw it. They certainly did see it as that, but it came at a significant price for many of them.
Diarmaid, I mean, how did that trauma manifest itself with regards to those individual people? You know.
Well, do you know, when I was looking at those older men in particular, I was thinking of Dennis McCullough. Dennis McCullough was a Belfast IRA man and IRB man, and he was very reflective in old age. He died in 1968, so he never reached the age of some of those men we were looking at there. But he reflected on what he had been through, and he said, "We lived in dreams always. I dreamt of an Ireland that never existed and never could exist." And he said, "I dreamt of the Irish people as a heroic people, as a Gaelic people. I dreamt of an Ireland very different to what I see now." And, you know, that's what I mean about the manifestations of disillusionment. I'm not suggesting everyone felt like that. Many people were able to get on, were able to forge rewarding careers. I mean, Dennis McCullough was a successful businessman. Many people were able to go back to what they had left or given up as men and women in order to fight in the War of Independence and were able to deal with the aftermath. But there were those who fell between the cracks. There were those who experienced huge impoverishment. And there were those who struggled to make the transition to civilian life. Part of that is the problem of them not knowing any other way of being or of living or of operating. And the way Ernie O'Malley, who wrote so beautifully about the War of Independence and Civil War, later put it, because he was very troubled himself, how do you recreate a spiritual state of mind? That's the way he put it. And by the time he got towards the end of his life, and he died quite young, he said that each man finds his enemy within himself. And I think even that assertion speaks volumes about the internal trauma and the dynamics. There's still pride there and a belief in the cause, I've no doubt about that. But they're the kind of manifestations that I'm talking about. And people who felt hugely disillusioned with the kind of society Ireland became. We saw Francis Stewart there in one of those photographs. He lives just up the road from me in Dundrum here in Dublin. And the way Francis put it, post-Civil War, we fought to stop Ireland falling into the hands of shopkeepers and publicans, and it fell into their hands. So there's a very strong class dimension to a lot of the disillusionment that comes afterwards. They don't believe that the republic that comes into existence eventually is the republic that they fought for. And of course, there's the ongoing sore of the partition of Ireland. Many volunteers across the border feel abandoned. They felt, in the words of Clare Healy, they'd been sold into political servitude for all time as a result of the border. So that's a legacy as well, of course, which is troubling to this day.
Seamus, coming to you, would those, when you were going around on your travels, would the people there have been talking about their allegiances post War of Independence and into the Civil War? Were they quite open about that, or more guarded?
They were quite guarded, I think. And I mean, as Dermot said, they were military. You know, they weren't highly political. They had a lot to say about the gangsters in the Dáil, you know, and then they would be very honest about that, very candid about that. They didn't like the politicians. They didn't like the politicians that were operating. You know, and they were obviously quite conservative in their own way. I mean, Catholic Ireland would have been their goal and their dream, to have a very, very Catholic Ireland. And so maybe even the things that we perhaps would promote, you know, more liberal attitudes towards divorce and things like that. I remember the divorce bill was coming up, and one of them said, "You'll come back from England and help us with the vote," meaning, you know, make sure that divorce doesn't come in. So, you know, you're dealing with that mentality as well. But they wanted the crack as well. You know, I mean, they wanted to sing songs and tell funny stories, and you know, they were deeply serious about what they'd done, and you know, very proud of it. But in that way, they'd moved on. You know, and I guess they felt they played a role in the country that we were all living in, and that was enough. You know, it was behind them. And of course, the ones that that I met were the ones that survived. As Dermot said, I mean, there must have been a lot of trauma, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of people that died young, you know, and they weren't the people I was meeting. I was meeting the survivors, the ones that could cope, the ones that had support networks, and you know, could rationalize their behavior.
Okay. And Diarmaid, in relation to that, I suppose we're talking about citizenship, and I suppose like in a post-conflict situation, people have to resolve that citizenship for themselves in some manner, however they deal with it. I'm just wondering about the issue of like pensions and military pensions. Was that like politicized in some manner in the end when they were being handed out, and was it an area of manipulation really, for not for control per se, but just an area of manipulation against people, working against people?
Well, there are different reasons for the introduction of the pensions. I mean, the pensions process actually begins in 1923, you know, so I mean, the ashes of the Civil War are still smouldering. And part of it has to do with a completely bloated National Army. We saw Sean Clancy there, who actually became a Free State captain in the National Army, and he was on that side. And there are 55,000 soldiers in the National Army on the pro-treaty side at the end of the Civil War. It's way too big, it's bloated, and it has to be drastically reduced to under 10,000. And the question is, where do they go? Where do they get jobs? How are they going to survive materially? That's one of the reasons for the introduction of pensions, is to try and placate the potential for trouble there. And of course, initially the pensions only applied to one side. You know, you had to show that you had active military service, or that, you know, you'd suffered, or you had endured wounds, or your family had been bereaved. You know, but that was for one side of the Civil War divide only. And Fianna Fáil, when it came into the Dáil in 1928 and 1929, was making noises about the pensions being a stitch up, and they were for one side only, and they were Common and Gael's way of rewarding its supporters. But then once Fianna Fáil got into power in 1932, they were quite determined that their side would be able to apply for pensions. So there are two big pensions acts, 1924 and then 1934. And by 1934, they've expanded the number of different forces who can qualify for a pension, including, of course, the anti-treaty side during the Civil War, the IRA, the veterans that we saw there, but also Cumann na mBan. So the women were able to apply as well. But the archive of the pensions collection is also a chronicle of great disappointment. Most people who applied for pensions were not successful. We know by the late 1950s that 82,000 people had applied for pensions, and in the region of 16,000 of them were successful. So a hell of a lot of people are very disappointed. The bar is set very high. It's quite a controversial process, not so much because of the politics of it, because I think in fairness to both sides of the Civil War divide, they did leave a lot of this work to the civil service. They did include in their review panels on their advisory bodies both sides of the Civil War. You know, there was a degree of integrity to it, but inevitably, you know, there are politicized aspects to it. The key question is what constitutes active service? Think about Kitty Bennett there, for example, the woman that we saw. You know, Kitty's house would have been a very important center for the IRA. Was that active service? Was harboring IRA men on the run, was that active service? That was very dangerous work that a lot of women were doing, and they were carrying messages and dispatches. But what they discovered during the pensions process is that that work didn't seem to be valued because they hadn't necessarily fired a shot. And that became a very controversial aspect to it, what constituted active service. And there was never really full consensus around that. So some of those questions do become politicized. There's an awful lot of disappointment. But interestingly, you know, Seamus mentioned there about the people who wouldn't have had anything to do with the Free State. There are a lot of people who wouldn't apply for pensions on the basis that they wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of the state that was administering the pensions, or else they didn't feel it was appropriate. You know, P.S. O'Hegarty on the pro-treaty side denounced the degeneracy and lack of public spirit or patriotism on the part of those who were applying for pensions. Now, it was very easy for him to say that. He was a comfortable civil servant. But you've got to look at, you know, for some people, this was about keeping their heads above water. It wasn't about making money. Over 70% of the people who were awarded pensions were awarded them on the lowest grade, the E grade, and they might be getting the equivalent of €2,000 a year in today's money, you know. So for some, it was a vital way of ensuring just basic subsistence or survival. But think as well I often think of John McGahern in his book Amongst Women, because Michael Moran is the very embittered or War of Independence veteran who was based on John McGahern's own father, Michael Moran, in the book. And he won't apply for a pension. And he denounces what Ireland has become. And he denounces those who he says are being awarded pensions who never fired a shot in their lives. And there was often a widespread belief, not necessarily without enough evidence, that there were people getting pensions who simply did not deserve them. Now, on the basis of the archival material, I wouldn't go along with that to the extent that some of the veterans did. But again, you know, that was how it manifested itself. Some of the tensions manifested itself. But for a lot of people, it was also a very private process because they had to lay bare very intimate details about their lives, their experiences, and their personal circumstances at the time that they were applying. And, you know, a lot of people did not want to be shouting from the rooftop. That's the other side of it. You can meet people who are very proud, defiant, even into old age. There are many others who won't talk about the war, who won't talk about the Civil War in particular because they don't want to reopen old wounds, or they find it too difficult. And again, that's not an Irish theme, that's a universal theme. You know, there is an internalization, there is a silence. Civil War legacies are difficult in any country that's endured them.
Very good. If anybody wants to ask any questions, just put them into the chat basically there, and we can go through them later on. Seamus, can I ask you just a couple of questions about the art element of everything, really? With regards taking shots, you know, how do you put people at ease, or, you know, what do you do? Is there do you have any strategy basically regards doing that? You know, what's your approach?
Not really. I think well, I try to be open and honest and you know, calm as much as possible. And, you know, as I said earlier, you know, a lot of these guys were quite quite elderly, infirm. Mobility was an issue with some of them. So you just had to slow down. And I think up until then, I hadn't really been doing a lot of portraiture and that kind of work. I was doing much more reportage and news stuff and you know, stuff that had a lot of movement in. And so this you know, I physically and personally had to calm down and slow down. And so I didn't really have a technique or a kind of devious device, but I just think you talk to people, you know, and portraits usually are about meeting somebody and I mean, I don't agree with this idea of like looking into someone's eyes and you see their soul. I mean, I think that's, you know, a lot of nonsense at times. But I think if you can make people feel comfortable and because they are sharing something with you with a picture, and they either comply or they don't. And if you get somebody looking at you a certain way, it's almost like they can withhold themselves. And I don't quite know how that's done, but it's definitely happened, and it definitely happens. And then you see the pictures where there's a communication, and I mean, it's one of the magical things about photography. You know, there's a lot of unknown stuff. And you hammer away at it, and you hope you end up with something that resonates. But it's usually a personal thing, you know. It's a human thing, and I think you know, being honest and open is the best way to approach people, get the best results as well.
Yeah. Well, I saw you doing some work, obviously, with the Syrian community here in Thurles, which is part of the exhibition. You were interested in taking those shots, I suppose, to give some sort of contemporary context to the show. Can you just explain a little bit about that and why
Sure.
that?
Yeah, because I'd been to Syria. I'd been to Syria before the war in 2007, and you could see that there was a secret police, secret element that was going on, and everything looked very rosy and wonderful place to be, you know, to go and travel. But you know, there was bad stuff going on, and then when the revolt happened, the rebellion, I went 3 times in 2012, and you know, it is a terrible situation. And in fact, in 2012, it looked like Assad was on the skids, and that was the end of him. And it's extraordinary that, you know, so many years later and so many more people have died. The situation hasn't been resolved. And you know, I was actually on my 3rd trip into Syria when it was a war. We were on this sort of night march in behind enemy lines, literally, and going through villages, which I didn't discover till afterwards, were actually held by Assad's army, and you know, barking dogs and being told to sort of walk in the shadow of the wall, because if you walk any further into the road, you'll be a silhouette and they'll see us. And that was an 8-hour sort of march. And in that time, I started thinking about, what am I doing here? This is someone else's war. This is another place. And you know, it gave me the thought that I should start looking at Ireland and doing some more work about my own people. And that ended up being a project called The Republic. So I have this connection with Syria, personal connection in some ways. And when you mentioned that there were these families in Thurles, I just thought, you know, what a wonderful way to sort of celebrate 100 years, you know, the War of Independence, the Republic came into being, that a country that fought for its independence and you know, tried to throw off oppression and tyranny, is now playing host to families who are fleeing the same thing. And I mean, I'm not comparing Ireland back then with Syria, in no way, but in principle, it's the same thing. So I was very interested to meet these people. You know, most of them are from Homs. You know, they're extraordinarily warm and welcoming and very easy to photograph. And they took me in and allowed me to photograph. I was only there for 2 days to do it, but you know, it was a great experience, and I actually love to do more and you know, connect more with them.
They have had a specific journey. They've been to Jordan, really, to a camp in Jordan, wasn't that it, for like 2 years?
Yeah, 2 or 3 years. You know, although that was safe, you know, I've been to those places, and they are bleak, you know, because you know, it's I mean, in a way, we're sort of experiencing it a little bit with the pandemic, you know, how your life is thrown into disarray. Nothing to the same extent, but it gives you an inkling of, you know, not being able to plan things, not knowing, you know, whether you're going to actually have work or you know, how things are going to shake out. You know, if you've got children, you know, how they're going to survive. The children that I met in Thurles, you know, are doing very well. It's the older generation, the parents and grandparents, I think, that would be having difficulties, because they look at they look at footage. I was in one person's house, and we were looking at this drone footage of just destroyed buildings, and they were saying that's home. So they can't go back there to that. There's nothing to go back to. So they're looking at Thurles, and the kids are getting on with their lives, learning, speaking English, probably learning Irish, playing football, playing Gaelic football. Inevitably they're going to become, involved with Irish culture, and become Irish. And where does that leave the parents who may not be working, are assimilating as well as they can, but it must be so difficult. It's a tragic story.
Just with regards to a question, somebody's asking here, that's Neil. Did any of the people refuse to be photographed? And I'm talking about either the War of Independence people and perhaps the Syrians as well.
No, none of the people that, obviously none of the people that I photographed refused, but there weren't people that were hiding, that were sort of saying no. We were really lucky, I think, to even find that 11 people. That was it was really surprising. I mean, it was down to Patrick Cooney, the guy who wrote the piece. He did all that research, and really uncovered people that were kind of forgotten about or slightly buried. And as I say, there wasn't a huge movement to uncover them and sort of celebrate them and do them some kind of honor. It wasn't, the mood wasn't like that. So on the Syrians, no, I had no problems at all. In fact, there were pictures, like they allowed me into the mosque. I photographed in the mosque. Really welcoming, really, really open. But I found that in Syria, that when I went to Syria the first time, there was very, very little fundamentalism going on. By the time I went there the third time, the fighters were having to accept weaponry and support from groups that they really had no connection with. But the West were not helping them enough, and to protect themselves and protect their families, they had to start doing deals with people that were more fundamentalist, and that's how that situation went. So no, anyway, to answer the question, I had no problems like that.
Diarmaid, can I come to you on that as well? Do you find that you're dealing in general with like archival sources, or I suppose in the past, have you been dealing with people? The difference between both with regards to getting information. Is there one way better, or are they just two completely different things?
You mean the process of getting information?
Yeah.
Well, what's really striking, I suppose, about the military service pension collection is that the people who were filling out application forms and were providing all these details, they were never to be aware that that would become a national archive. That raises very interesting questions about the responsibility that you have to exercise when using that material, and to be sensitive and to be conscious of the ethics of it, that you're not using this material in order to try and belittle anyone or to embarrass anyone. There are very intimate details in there that shouldn't necessarily find their way into publication. That is one of the prices we pay for something which is quite positive, which is quite a liberal approach to the release of archival material. There'll be some systems where this material will be locked up indefinitely, So obviously, as a historian, I'm very glad we have it. But no archive is the truth. There's no such thing. These are versions of people's individual experiences and stories. They're their stories. They're their experiences. I'm not saying there are not documented realities and facts in these archives. There are, of course. But you've got to be conscious of how people are constructing certain things years afterwards. A lot of people were dependent on the lottery of survival. Seamus mentioned this earlier on. He gets to photograph the people, obviously, who've survived. A lot of people who are looking for pensions had to have their information verified. And that would often be dependent or contingent on whether those who had fought with them had survived. And it's very hard luck for a lot of them that they just cannot establish through the testimony of other people the veracity of what they are claiming. So you get all of that going on in the pensions archive as well. We have one of the best documented revolutions anywhere. Ireland has been described as quite a laboratory for the study of revolution, just because of the sheer scale of the paper trail that we have. And that's partly because of the size of Ireland and the relative short scale of conflict. When you're talking there about Syria and the longevity of it, which is one of the great tragedies of it, you know, what we have, particularly with the Civil War, for example, is a very short and brutal war. It lasts from June 1922 to April 1923. And, you know, people recover from civil war in different ways, and the politics recovers in different ways. We often talk about civil war politics, but, you know, democracy survived in Ireland and it withstood very difficult decades in the 1930s. So our post-Civil War dispensation is not as tragic as it might have been, or certainly as it was perhaps in other countries. Like, we still have some shared themes, like dislocation, the dislocation Seamus is talking about. There's a Syrian family living around the corner from me here, a middle-class family who came over, who have extraordinary drive and ambition, especially for their children, and they're very warm people. But their wider family is fractured as a result of the Civil War, and they too are looking at shells that were their homes. So those kind of Civil War experiences are they're very different, I suppose, to the Irish experience when you consider the nature of the conflict that we had. And that's not in any way to downplay some of the brutality that occurred, you know. So we do get an awful lot of documentation that illustrates the nature of the conflict that went on here. And as I mentioned earlier on, these are universal themes, but then the individual countries have their own dynamics and have their own particular experiences of conflict, you know. A lot of what happened, say, in Finland, which has its civil war a couple of years before Ireland, and at a later stage then Spain in the 1930s. You know, a lot of the long-term effects of civil wars are similar across the globe. And of course, individual difficulties for families and communities who sometimes are pitted against each other. Again, they're all universal themes, but there are different ways in different areas of dealing with the legacy. So, you know, part of what we're doing, I suppose, in looking at the decade of revolution generally, is looking at, you know, the texture of that warlike experience. And that's why photographers and their work is so important. It really illuminates the texture of the warlike experience and the people who are at the center of it and sometimes victims of it. That's one thing we're trying to do, but we're also trying to figure out the legacy, how you best mark it, how you memorialize it, how you remember it. They're very troubling questions everywhere. I mean, America still is not settled on how it should commemorate its Civil War. The American Civil War is still being played out in many respects. The Spanish Civil War question is by no means resolved. It's just too soon.
No, completely, absolutely. Neil is asking here as well. He's asking, Diarmaid, in all your research of your archives, what is the most surprising aspect that you believe to be true as opposed to popular myth?
That there was no master plan, that there's no one size fits all. It was interesting when Seamus was talking about I suppose the assertions of some of those veterans about what they wanted and what they believed they were doing. And they have faith in their cause. There's no doubt about that. But there is no one size fits all. You know, you get all of the normal range of emotions and frailties and very admirable characteristics in people anywhere. There's an awful lot of unintended outcomes. You know, there's chance, there's luck. There are all of those different elements that go into the mix, you know. So I suppose that for me is the value of the archive. And it's very important to underline that at the moment, because, you know, we're experiencing a lot of controversy at the moment about how aspects of the past are being presented today. And, you know, narratives do get distorted, and a lot of complications can get grossly simplified over time. So that to me is the overarching message of the archival material. It's just the sheer messiness of it all. That's not to say that many aspects of the story cannot be inspiring, but it's just that sense of a fractured landscape.
Seamus, can I ask you regards that? I mean, is there a need, and I suppose it's for Diarmaid as well to a certain extent, but there is a need for like a mythology around all these areas? It can't be, we can't allow it to be messy to a certain extent. We do need a strong mythology to be able to place the state on like a strong footing, really. You know, we need that. We need that good narrative. We need that strong, you know, growth narratives to start off with. Start a new
That
society.
certainly wouldn't be the role of the photographer or the journalist. I don't think. I think what photography does is it. Of course, the camera always lies, but if you go into a situation and you are out to sort of prove a certain truth, then I think that's the biggest lie of all. I mean, I'm always just open to what I'm seeing and hearing. And in fact, it was interesting when I took these photographs. It was the late 90s. I was brought up in Dublin, middle class background. The north was sort of up there, and although my father was from Mayo, and I know that some grandparents were involved in the IRA in some way. They were school teachers, but I think they used to harbour people on the run. This is what I was told. It was never talked about at home, and the north was it was another country. And so I learned a lot on this journey around Ireland, meeting these guys. And it really, I mean, I hadn't read Early O'Malley's book when I met these guys, but I've since read it a couple of times. It's an extraordinary book. So I think, and also what Diarmaid was saying, there's nothing in life is black and white. Nothing is. I mean, look at if you look at your own situation in your family, and one person's version of something and another person's version is going to be different. Multiply that by how many thousand, how many million, and of course we have to be able to sort of live and continue and get up in the morning, and not be too confused. But I think it's certainly not the role of the photographer or the writer, the journalist to mythologize. I think mythologies also have a way of becoming, without too much intent. Otherwise, it's propaganda.
I mean, you do need for establishing a narrative of your independence and of your struggle for independence, and that sense that you don't have to apologize for how your state came into being, which is a very legitimate viewpoint to take. This state today doesn't have to apologize for how it came into being, given the historic context of 100 years ago and what was at stake. And we talked earlier on about mandates and recognition of the right to self-determination and so on. That's one part of it. But inevitably, of course, the founding mythologies can become far too simplistic as well. It's also interesting that people opt out. John Ryan there, for example, he didn't want to fight in the Civil War. I looked very closely at the GPO garrison from 1916, and 42% of them opted out of the Civil War. That's a very high percentage. So a lot of them felt that this involvement in the Civil War, not only did they find it personally distasteful to be fighting against those who had been their comrades, but I think they were also worried about what it would do to that very notion of a war of independence and the narrative around that, and the joint sense of purpose that existed during the War of Independence period. And then there are those, of course, who are not soldiers, who are not politicians, but are a very important part of this story, this revolutionary period. My own grandfather, who spent most of his life in Thurles, where my father was born, he came up from Kerry as a Kerry Republican in the early 1900s and ended up working in Hayes Hotel. And he was a very committed Republican. But as far as I'm aware, and he died in the 1960s, he doesn't seem to have been actively involved in the IRA. And yet, when he was retiring, he was telling stories of having to harbour Republicans during that War of Independence period, and at one stage getting a beating from the Black and Tans. So, I mean, that's a part of a war situation as well. It's not just about the soldiers and the politicians who are centrally associated with it. It's also about the civilian experience. And we have much more of a sense now of how it impacted on civilians and all of the inconveniences that come with a warlike situation, and the privations and the house raids and the physical destruction and just the sheer disruption of everyday lives. Now, people try and get on with their lives in the midst of it. I mean, I remember talking about a project in 1916, which was trying to recover letters from ordinary civilians during that period. And one of the sons of a couple who had been courting during the 1916 Rising, he was asked as an old man, what side were your parents on in 1916? And he said they weren't on any side. They were on the getting on with life side. That goes on in the midst of war. So we have to factor that in. People are not always preoccupied with the great notions of nationhood. They're just trying to put bread on the table, or they're trying to get on with their lives in various ways.
Great. Seamus, can I ask you as well, we watched your movie, A Dog Called Money, the film with PJ Harvey last night, a fantastic movie, a documentary on her making her album, and also a travelogue to a certain extent with regards finding out some of the situations that she was interested in the world. Just in relation to that, and like I suppose your other work, is there a theme that you're chasing yourself with regards to what you're doing, and I suppose the people that you interact with? You know, what is there a Seamus Murphy overall theme, your work or what have you? You know,
not really. I sort of just follow my my interests, and if I fell into conflict, places of conflict to work. You know, I went in 1994 the first time to Afghanistan, and that was based on the fact that my sister had been a hippie, and I mean, she was at that age, and went on the hippie trail, and kept talking about Afghanistan being the most amazing place. You know, India, Iran, yeah, great, but actually Afghanistan was the place. So I got a chance to go there, and it was in the height of their civil war in '94. It was a really awful time, and I'd never had plans to be a war photographer. It never inspired me. I never looked at pictures of war and thought, God, I really want to do that. So it was my experience of Afghanistan that made me look at those places, not for the bang bang, but for the situations people find themselves in. I mean, the way Dermot's talking about, things back in those days, and you kind of think, God, it'd be amazing to have been there, just to sort of witness that. And that's kind of what drives me sometimes when I go to these places, that I want to be where history is being made. And unfortunately, wars are like an exclamation mark in history. They are bang, it happens, and things change very dramatically. And people getting on with their lives, but they're up against extraordinary odds. And I find all that very, very humbling. It's a learning thing, but also, you can maybe tell a story that it's hard for those people when they're trying to survive to do it themselves. And I've found, I've got images from Afghanistan that Afghans couldn't have taken because they were too busy trying to flee or trying to survive. And so, I mean, I'm interested in history, and I'm interested in humanity, I suppose, and I just follow my interests.
And in relation to that, with regards to work that you're doing at the moment in London, the editing that you're doing can you talk about that with regards to Pat Inglesby?
Yeah.
What is that? Is that a documentary, or it's a documentary on him essentially?
It's a documentary. I met Pat. I was making a short film for the New Yorker. It was the 50th anniversary of the death of JFK, and I was 3 when he came to Dublin, and I remember that. And I wanted to make a film that sort of linked Ireland with JFK and the fact that I was away a lot of the time, and I was coming back to Dublin more recently. And anyway, I made this film, but I wasn't really happy with it needed one more perspective, I thought. And I vaguely remembered a character that I used to see occasionally on television. I was a bit older than probably the kids who were watching him as kids, but he always struck me as being extraordinarily funny, very absurd, and quite unlike anything else you'd see on RTE or hear on RTE. And there was a great wisdom there, but he was funny as hell. And I kept thinking, God, I wonder whatever happened to that guy. And I could imagine his voice in this film. Anyway, I tracked him down. He was selling his books outside the Bank of Ireland, and we met, and I recorded some of his poems. And he said to me, look, I'm often asked to make a documentary on my life, and I've always refused. But if you want to do it, you can do it. And it was an amazing opportunity, so I took it on. And I'm 3 years later, the shooting is pretty much finished. Screen Ireland are backing it, and I'm editing it now, and that's just a great story of a man who, you know, had polio as a child, very serious mental health problems. He blames the church. He had a condition called scruples, was institutionalized, ended up getting electric shock treatments, incredible obstacles in his life. And yet he's come through this, writes the most sublime poetry. He's a lesson and a tonic for us all. And I just think it's a great story, and he's a great human being. So, you know, that interested me. I went for it.
Okay. Okay, listen, that's great. I think we're sort of like done really at this stage with regards to that. I don't know whether anybody's any other questions on the, do we have any of the Syrian pictures there, Seamus, available? Do you have any of those with you?
I don't know. I have them handy. Let me just check.
Well, just to say that the exhibition is available online on www.thesourceartscentre.ie, and you can view the whole show there. Basically, there's a link to an exhibition called Art Steps, or an online exhibition called Art Steps, and you can have a look at it there. If you don't have them, it's okay. It's no.
Could I ask Dermot a question? Actually, I've got an interest in you know, what would he say is the legacy of the War of Independence internationally? Because they were a bunch of guys who took on the great British Empire and sort of, probably for the first time in many ways, you know, brought them to a standstill and made them negotiate. Was it an inspiration to places like India and you know,
there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
We know from Indian nationalists' own words and own reflections on the Irish inspiration that they found it hugely important, and it was referred to them. I was actually thinking of a photograph there earlier on, which you'd be interested in, which was of De Valera with Nehru. And, you know, here were the two, the two figures so closely associated with their national movements. And they had much in common, you know. I mean, even though they're vastly, vastly different entities, you know. So yes, I mean, Ireland comes to its accommodation with the British Empire at an early stage, you know, and of course, you know, partition was also a part of the 1940 settlement, which led to much bloodshed as well when it comes to the whole question of Indian independence. So there are parallels, but even more further afield, you know, in relation to the guerrilla style of campaign, you know, it's been maintained that there were even Chinese resistance fighters who found inspiration from the tactics and the methods that the IRA had adopted, you know. But I suppose one of the enduring themes there, and it's always been a controversial one, is the extent to which you can create conditions conducive to dialogue, or you can create a path to dialogue through these kind of campaigns, you know, which is what happened. You know, I mean, there's no doubt that Britain was forced to the negotiating table as a result of the IRA's campaign, you know. And, you know, that's always going to be internationally a very controversial theme, you know, of A, what legitimacy is there for that kind of campaign, and B, what's going to be the end product of it. So yes, there would have been those who were looking at the Irish example because it happened at that very early stage. But I think there would have also been an awareness, though perhaps, you know, we have to be careful here of assuming that there's significant international interest in Ireland. There actually wasn't that much international interest in Ireland in overall terms, you know, but certainly there would have been a consciousness that what comes after the occupier has left can be very, very tricky and very, very divisive.
But that is that post-colonial thing, Diarmaid, isn't it? Really, yeah. That we can see that with Palestine as well.
Yeah, what did they leave behind, you know? And I mean, that's the interesting thing. I was over in Westminster there last year doing research in the parliamentary archives there. The papers of David Lloyd George, who of course negotiated with Irish Republicans and didn't have too many ideological hang-ups about that. But he was in coalition with a conservative colleagues at the time, including, of course, Winston Churchill. And what I was really reminded of in the archive was just how small fry Ireland was, because a lot of the correspondence is much more preoccupied with Constantinople and Iraq and Greece So if you think of the imperial jigsaw, you know, Ireland was only one piece of that, and quite a small piece of that. It's an inconvenience, it's an irritant, and sometimes when they think they've settled the question, of course, it can come back to bite them and haunt them, as it does to this day. But, you know, it is a salutary reminder, I suppose, for an Irish researcher of just how small a part we are of that bigger story.
Do they underestimate that, do you think, the Brits?
Yes, I've no doubt about it, sure. I mean, that's why we're reading the headlines we're reading today.
Right, Brexit, yeah.
You know, I mean, that was one of the most interesting things, I suppose, about the issue that proved to be the most intractable problem, you know, the border, and the whole question of whether Northern Ireland needed to be treated differently. The very issue that was ignored during the Brexit campaign. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away.
No. And of course, it's the same thing again of like Britain removing himself from an actual like structure and a mess being created as they move out, basically, really, isn't it? Not to put it too crudely. Neil is asking here as well. He's asking if either you or Diarmaid, or you or Seamus were at an event, that you could have been at an event in the War of Independence or Civil War. Which one would it have been? Any specific event that you would have loved to have been alive to attend or photograph?
I just did a quick text reply just saying that what would have interested me, and it wouldn't have been one event, it would have been the daily life, the description by Bat Moriarty of all those guys saying the rosary on the road and then being fed buckets of milk and bread. I mean, I find that sort of detail fascinating. And men on the run, men and women on the run, and arms dumps, and just how things looked, because we read about them, we can't really visualize them. And that would have been a fascinating thing to have documented.
Well, I tell you what I would have liked to have been at was the party on the 11th of July 1921, after the ceasefire between the Crown Forces and the IRA. There was a very upbeat and positive atmosphere in Dublin, because we have to remind ourselves, that ultimately people want wars to finish. They want them to be over. Most people, and that sense that's there briefly, however briefly it's there, that sense of possibility, that this peace might endure, that it might last, that we mightn't have to go back to what we've been dealing with. It would have been nice to have experienced that moment of light or hope in the middle of a very difficult time.
I think we would hope that for the Syrian community as well. I think in this instance as well, this period as well. I think that brings us to the end of this evening's discussion. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. Can I thank Tipperary County Council and the Arts Council, who support Source Arts Centre and support our gallery exhibitions like Citizens. Can I thank Declan and Star Systems here in Thurles for the logistics in running the event? And can I thank, of course, to Diarmaid for his excellent insights, and to Seamus for the great exhibition. So Citizens is on show in the Arts Centre until January the 16th. We're going to have another online event probably in January in relation, probably discuss Syria a little bit more and the context within that show. So the show can be seen online on www.sourceartscentre.ie, and you can view an online exhibition of it basically there. And thanks to everyone who offered questions tonight, and thanks to everybody who came online basically to see the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed that, Seamus. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. That was fascinating. Yeah. I mean,
and Brandon, thanks very much.
Yeah.
He's gone off, is he?
Forgot to turn off, are we? Guys, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether you're gone, Seamus and Diarmaid. Gone, are they?